Hi guys, Sam here, and today we are going to jump back in time to talk about this woman right here. Anne Bradstreet was America's first published female poet, and she lived in the colonial era of American history. Now, this era definitely shaped the way Bradstreet wrote because it was an era that was heavily focused on the church and religion and very traditional in its beliefs. And this can be seen in Bradstreet's poetry in that no matter what she's writing about, be it her children, her husband, her poems, her love for nature, she's always bringing it back around to a theocentric worldview. And the other thing about Bradstreet's time period was that despite the fact that it was very, very rigid in its beliefs, there were also radical changes taking place. For example, Anne's friend Anne Hutchinson was starting to begin her movement of antinomianism. And so you can see that this is a time of both great tradition and great turmoil, and this is reflected in Bradstreet's writings, which were considered radical for her day and age, although not for the present era. In her lifetime, Bradstreet wrote about 30 poems, but her three most famous works are To My Dear and Loving Husband, the author to her book, and Verses Upon the Burning of Our House. Her first and probably most well-known poem that I'm going to discuss is To My Dear and Loving Husband, which was a love letter to her husband Simon Bradstreet. Anne and her husband Simon were incredibly in love, and their marriage was really an exception to the rule of, the very strict relationships that a lot of Puritan couples had. And so this is an outpouring of her love and affection for her husband. The author to her book, which was a poem that Bradstreet wrote later in her life, was a reflection upon the fact that she had just discovered that her brother-in-law, unbeknownst to her, had taken a collection of her poems and was going to have them published in England. In the poem, Bradstreet has an almost maternal feeling over her poems, lamenting their lack of skill and her desire for them to be well received. Bradstreet's poem Verses Upon the Burning of Our House is another one of her most successful and famous works, and it is one of her more emotional poems. It details what happens when the Bradstreet home unexpectedly burns down, and it is her lamenting the loss of all of her earthly possessions and goods and the memories that the house contained. She spends most of the poem discussing all of her things that have burned in the fire and how upset she is, but in the last set of verses she brings it back around and reminds herself that no matter what happens to her possessions on earth, her hope and treasure lies above, which is an example of how Bradstreet continually brought every situation back around to glorifying God. Historically speaking, Anne Bradstreet is incredibly significant in the fact that she is America's first published female poet, which is an incredible accomplishment for the time period when women were not supposed to be active members of life in the church, in the home, or in society at large. They were supposed to be the homemakers and the domestic caretakers. And so the fact that Anne Bradstreet became published is incredibly historically significant and a huge step forward for women everywhere. Now, like I said a little bit earlier, Anne Bradstreet wrote from a very religious standpoint. No matter the subject matter of her poem, she always brings it back around to God. And this is very indicative of the time period that she lived in. She lived in a society where religion was everything, and that definitely shows in her work. The environment that she grew up in, of a heavy church involvement and strong faith, definitely are evident in all of her work. Now, the thing about Anne Bradstreet's works is that they can't really be linked to any events of major historical significance because she wrote for herself and her family, and so her works reflect on that. She talks about her husband, her children, nature, and home life, but she doesn't really talk about major events of the day. However, there is a feminist undercurrent to her works, which is notable because she lived in a time of early feminism. She, along with Anne Hutchinson, is considered one of America's first feminists, and this is incredibly evident in her work. Now, part of the reason that Anne Bradstreet is still remembered today and that her legacy continues, in addition to the fact that she was America's first published female poet, is the fact that her subject matter is entirely relatable no matter what time period you're living in. Discussing themes like family, love, loss, religion, and personal struggles, Anne Bradstreet is incredibly open and honest, and so the reader can always relate to what she's saying. Now, the thing about Anne Bradstreet is that she still continues to be culturally relevant to this day, even hundreds of years after her works were originally published. Bradstreet lived in a time where radical changes were taking place in society, and that holds true of today. Her works are still studied in classrooms and by feminists and by people who seek a deeper understanding of what life was like in colonial America. Her works are ever relatable and ever understandable, and Anne Bradstreet will forever be remembered as one of America's greatest poets, as well as one of the founding mothers of women in poetry.